The extension starts up when you visit the page where it's enabled. The first thing that runs is this page, content scripts. Let's focus first on this part. The first thing is we inject a script. The script that we inject is inject.js. I'll show you that next. The reason we inject a script is because content scripts do have access to the DOM, but they have very limited access. If you want to access, let's say, properties on a DOM element that React adds to sync it with the React structure, you can't access it from the content script. However, you can access it from this injected script, this web accessible resource. The injected script is very simple. It creates a mutation observer. A mutation observer basically will fire this async method anytime any nodes are added. There's all sorts of options over here. It's basically any DOM elements are added or removed. This way we can always, if a field somehow shows up later, we can always register it even if it didn't show up at the start of the app. What it calls is this register inputs method. Register inputs method is very simple. Fields that we've set up logic to handle have a auto discover method and calls the auto discover on each one of these. And if there's any text fields or password fields on the page, they'll be registered and then you'll see them here. Now let's take a quick look at this auto discover method. This is the base form input class. This class is a base class for all form inputs, and it contains a lot of the shared logic. For example, field discovery. Auto discover basically uses this helper method where we pass this.xpath. So in other words, every subclass of base form input has an XPath property which describes exactly where to find this type of class, exactly what type of elements, and I'll explain the XPath later. But basically, using the XPath that you specify in each subclass, it'll return elements and then checks to see if it already has been registered, so you don't register a field twice, and then registers a field by instantiating a new form field class or input class with this element as the argument. And we'll just take a quick look at the constructor of the base form field. First of all, just stores the element and then sets some IDs and stuff, which we can get to later. Attaches a change listener, and then we attach the UI, the specific UI for each. It's a separate React little app, and we attach it for each field. I decided to choose XPath because XPath is a little bit more flexible and powerful than CSS selectors, and they allow you to be extremely specific. I'll just try to go over a quick explanation of what these XPaths are. You're looking for this XPath on the document, so that means look for a div that's within this document and apply the following limitations to this div. This attribute starts with this. The div contains an input element which has an attribute of type text and does not contain any element that has an attribute of aria has pop-up, because some other form field inputs have an input type text, but they're not a text input, they're like a drop-down or something. You can tell them apart because those drop-downs there's an element that has an aria has pop-up. And actually the password input is exactly the same as the text input, except that the type over here is just changed. Now let's go take a look at how we look up answers. Let's take a look at the path method. First of all, we want to know what page the field is on, and on Workday at least, the page is in an H2 on the document. So literally just find the first H2 and you'll know what the name of the page is. You'll have sign in, application questions. Then section is a repeatable section that contains the same fields. So you can have work history 1 or work history 2, and they'll both have start date. The field name is going to be start date on both of them, but it's a different start date. By default, this is always going to be a blank string, just for simplicity. Then there's field type. Different field types have different ways of storing answers, which will be implemented later. Field type is, let's say, text input, password input, drop down. There's like different types of drop downs, and then the actual field name. This is one of the areas which I think will differentiate this extension from any other extension out there. Basically, the field name is taken from what's usually a label within the enclosing div. For email address, it's pretty straightforward. And every time it'll look up the path plus, and as part of the path, it'll be the it'll say email address. It'll just do an exact match. In other words, if there's a field with the page, sign in, with a blank section, text input field type, the field name of email address, then it can pull it. However, starts with matching will be added because, for example, the first question, which is, have you ever worked at, and then the name of the company. So now if you save, have you ever worked at Google? And the answer is usually no. So if you just store the answer by have you ever worked at, then the default behavior will be first check for an exact match, and if you can't find an exact match, check for a starts with match. So now you're able to be a lot more flexible in answering fields that you've never answered the exact question before. Here is a subclass of base form input for text inputs. So the answer filling is usually going to be specific to the type of field. A basic text field is pretty simple. Get the answer, right, which we just looked up, we just found. Fire the React onChange with an object that looks like an event. Comes in as E, and it goes E.target.value will be answer. And that's how you successfully fill it. Because if you just set the value attribute on the DOM, nothing happens. It can get very complicated. Saving a current value, let's go back to base form input, is pretty similar to filling it. In addition to this.path, you also have field snapshot, which just combines path with this.current value. So you send a save message and save it. If you're familiar with Chrome extensions from beforehand, you'll know that if you want to communicate between your content script and your background script, the Chrome extension API provides you with message capabilities. In our situation, we're going to want to communicate between the injected script and the content script. The best way to do that is take advantage of the fact that if the injected script dispatches an event on the DOM, then the context script can actually have an event listener that can intercept that event, and vice versa. Also take advantage of the fact that custom events has an extra field called detail, where you can put any sort of data that's structured clonable, which basically means it's like an HTTP request. You can send standard data there. You can't send a reference to current element on the DOM from the injected script and give the content script all the privileged access that the injected script has, but you can send any strings, objects, arrays, numbers. What you want to do is you want to set up an event listener in the content script and enable the injected script to dispatch events to that event listener. And then you also want it to have a complete cycle of like a request and response, because you don't want to have to, in every place you want to dispatch an event to the content script, you don't want to have to set up another custom event handler to receive, because you get a response from the content script by the content script sending another message back. To simplify this process, I created a server and a client which encapsulate this logic and make it very easy to A, set up a server in one of the scripts, and then B, set up a client in the other script. The client's job is to actually send requests, and then C, to send requests from the client to the server, and the whole request response cycle is encapsulated already, so you just treat that request as if it was a regular fetch request. Let's take a look at the server. You instantiate the server with just a URL, which is really just a string that you're also going to instantiate the client with, so that now the client is going to name its custom events by that string. And then you just add an event handler which calls handle request. And handle request is really a wrapper for some error handling, and then to send the response, and then it'll call dispatch. Dispatch is basically you're going to pass in different method names, kind of like paths, to call different methods that you make available on the server. First you dispatch the method, and then send the response. Here you have the dispatch method and the send response method. And here is the register method, which you use to register new method on the server. Let's take actually a quick look at the content script to see the register method in action. You see we instantiate a new server, which means now this server is listening for events that are dispatched on the DOM, and the event has this name. Here you can see we register a new path called save answer, and if it ever receives an event that the path is save answer, it'll call this method. Now let's take a look at the client. Like the server, the client gets instantiated with just the URL, which it then uses to dispatch messages named by that URL which the server is listening to. Most of the complication of the communication between the client and the server is in the client send method. We want the server to also be able to respond. In other words, we can definitely notify the server of events, but sometimes we want to request data from the server. So we need to handle the response that the server is going to send back. Before we send the request event to the server, we first want to anticipate an event that the server is going to send back. What we'll do is we'll generate a request ID, and that request ID will be used we'll send it along to the server, and the server will send its response in an event named by that request ID. Every time you call send, it sets up a new event handler, and then after it receives a request, it removes that event handler. So it's all fully contained and very clean. Let's go through the sequence of events that happens when you call send on the client. First, you generate a request ID, and then you add an event listener on the DOM, listening for an event named by that request ID. Then you send the request. Once you've already have this event listener listening for the response event, then you dispatch the request event to the server, which is, let's say, in the context script. And then once you get the response back, you first remove the event handler so that you're not littering and cluttering up with event handlers, and then you return the response. And that enables you to have a very clean request response cycle where everything is encapsulated nicely in this class. Let's take a quick look at the UI that the user sees next to each fillable field. We use React and Material UI for the design and actual implementation. And I also just want to clarify how the React app interacts with the form input class, which does all the work. Let's take a look at the form input class constructor method. As you can see, you render the app component and you pass the form input class in its entirety as the single prop. In the React app, you basically use this prop as a server. In order for React to stay fresh, you really have to use React state management to call all the methods properly in order for the React app to stay fresh. For now, the React app has a refresh method which refreshes any piece of data which the React app needs from the input class. A Boolean whether or not there is an answer in storage, the actual answer, and what is the current value that has been entered either by the user or by the extension into this field. On app startup, we do two things. First of all, we call refresh, and we also add an event listener because sometimes there's events that happen outside of the React app and we want the React app to respond to those events. For example, if a user enters some letters, that happens in the form field. The input class has a listener listening for those changes, and then the input class needs a way to trigger the React app to refresh. And you do that by adding another event listener. This one you just add on the parent element of this field. Then you have the ability to save again, and you'll see we call refresh by all these methods. I think that's it.